Hello, everyone. Happy Valentine's Day. It's the 14th of February, so I think that's what that means. Thanks for joining us again. Again, some of you are here live, some will be here later. But I really kind of struggled this week to find a topic to talk about on Valentine's Day. I thought it'd be fun until I found the topic, and then I'm like, of course, this would be perfect to talk about marriage and how we record marriages and the history of marriage as it pertains to local history, but even history across the world and the country, and how we use marriage records in our research. And also, we have a really neat gentleman from East Aurora's history, the Reverend Richard Sandford, who got the nickname the Marrying Minister. And I'll tell you about him in a bit. I've written about him. And in addition to him just being a really interesting person, his record keeping was very detailed, and his records were preserved. So that helps us a lot in learning more about who married whom and where they got married and those marriage records that might have otherwise been lost. And the reason that his records are important is because we need to talk probably about the history of marriage to begin with. And that leads into why Reverend Sanford's records were so important. We have gotten, anybody who's gotten married, right? You fall in love, hopefully, before you get married. And when you go before your wedding, you have to go to either your town clerk or your city clerk and get what they call a marriage license. And that's not your certificate. That's just the document that allows you to get married. And so what happens is the town clerk or the city clerk, you present to that person the information that allows them to determine that you are legally able to get married, that you are an adult, that all the things that you need to do. And in the old days, you had to go through a blood test. They don't do that anymore. And we'll talk about that, the reasoning for that in a bit of why they had the blood test to begin with. But the clerk determines that, yes, you are allowed to get married. There's nothing in the law that says you can't, like you're not related too closely, or you're underage, or previously married. They actually require documentation that any previous marriages either ended in a divorce or you're widowed. So you get that license. And we're so used, and then when you go to get married, the minister or the officiant, the judge, sees your license that gives you permission to get married, and then they sign that, and then it goes back to the clerk who issues your marriage certificate. So we're used to, anybody who's gotten married, who's alive today, who's gotten married, is used to that process. You go in and you get married. But that wasn't always the case. And actually, until 1881, New York State didn't have vital statistics requirements. So you didn't have to get a marriage license from the government. Marriage was actually a contract either between two people or two families in some cases, and it was a religious thing. And so there would be not necessarily a record of the marriage. You would get married sometimes in front of your family, maybe in the backyard of the bride's family, or just in the living room, the parlor of the minister. And that's where Reverend Sandford comes into play. And you would have a certificate maybe from the church, and it would be in the church record. Or if a justice of the peace were doing it, you would have that, but you wouldn't have what you have today, the process today, where there would be a vital statistics record. Well, the reason we have vital statistics records today, and the clerk records all marriages, births, deaths, is in 1881, actually smallpox was becoming a problem, and a bunch of other diseases as well, cholera, but smallpox was the clincher for this, and it was being brought in on the railroad. So 1860s is when East Aurora got the railroad coming through town, but people were traveling much more quickly. and much more readily, and people were going from one place to another much more efficiently. So you could get from one end of New York State to another much quicker than you did before. And with that came disease. So if you had smallpox or you had another cholera or other really contagious disease, you could bring it in and wipe out communities, and this happened. Influenza, smallpox, all that, which the grip they called, with influenza. And consumption, and all these old words you hear. But if they were transmitted easily, you could easily have an epidemic or a pandemic. And the issue back then is they didn't always identify it very quickly. And so you could have people dying or having widespread illness without being able to quickly handle it. So in 1881, the New York State decided, in order to try to, in an effort to try to keep track of illness and keep track of pandemics and to avoid them, was to register all deaths, register all births, and with that register all marriages. So a cause of death would be put on the marriage or on the death certificate, and so then the state officials, the county, and then part of this whole vital statistics thing was to appoint health officers in local communities, and they could more quickly determine if there is a batch of illnesses that match each other, that they could compare notes essentially and figure out if there was an illness or a pandemic starting, and they could try to nip it early on. So they did all that, death certificates and birth certificates, and marriage licenses, marriages certificates, all together. And so every time you had one of those milestones, you would record it with your local town clerk. And the towns had health officers, and they were in charge of keeping track of this. So this is why today your marriage certificates and marriage licenses are filed with the state health department, and the health department keeps track of these things. The Vital Statistics Bureau of the state is through the health department. It's because it originated with with an effort to keep down the chances of another pandemic, and so that's why they did that. So this started out in the 1880s, but it was, sometimes you won't find, just as an aside, you won't find a record you might be looking for back then, because a lot of towns and villages and cities weren't doing a very good job of following the law. Or there were cases where records were lost. What's a great part of this is that records are kept both at the local and the state level. So God forbid something happens to a local town hall, they still would theoretically have the record kept somewhere else. So that's how we got to the point of marriage licenses, where the government was actually issuing your license. But before that, it was a system of your church giving you the authority to get married, and you'd follow church law or church regulations for the particular church you were a part of. There would not necessarily be a formal government record of your marriage. So this is important, because a lot of times when we look back and try to find a marriage, some people are looking for a marriage certificate for somebody from, say, the 1840s, and we might not have it in an archive, because, or the town clerk's office might not have it because it doesn't exist, and because they weren't required to have it. This is the interesting part of why witnesses are required at weddings. You'll notice most of the time, if you have a wedding, you might ask your best man and your maid of honor to be your witness, and they have to actually sign the license that gets sent in. And the whole point of witnesses is not necessarily to make your marriage license valid so you can get the certificate and the officiant has signed off that you did get married. It's to later on, if something, God forbid, happens to your marriage, you have somebody who can testify in court that you did actually vow to get married to each other. And that's all the state law requires you to do. All the rest of the stuff you see at the wedding is all extra. All you have to do is, in the presence of witnesses, is to take each other as husband and or as spouses, husband and wife, husband now, and wife now, that they changed the law. But you just have to have the witnesses there and say to each other that you take each other as spouses. Enter into that contract. All the rest of that stuff is extra. So, so that's why the witnesses are important, because back in the day, back in the 1800s, and we see this not just with weddings and marriages, is we had this happen in the War of 1812 with pension applications. You wouldn't necessarily enlist in the War of 1812, but later if you filed for a pension, you'd have a neighbor file an affidavit to say, yes, I saw this man leave to go serve in the war, or you had one of the people that you served with fill out an affidavit. So you never like signed up ahead of time, but later on someone would attest, swear under oath that you actually did what you are claiming you did. And the same thing would happen with marriages. There might not be an actual a marriage certificate after you got married, but if anything were to happen later on, you would have somebody who was present there and could be a witness to that you did get married, that you did, in the presence of that witness or multiple witnesses, take each other as spouses. So that whole idea of witnesses is very important, because in the days prior to vital statistics, there might not be a formal record of that marriage. It may be somebody who was there and has to testify that they witnessed that you did it, that you didn't sign any papers. So if you weren't married in a church, or even if you were, church records don't always last forever, things would happen. So that's an important thing to think about if you're researching anybody's marriage. Is sometimes people come in and they want to see a marriage certificate that does not exist, a government issued marriage certificate. And marriage is one of the few things, it might be, well, there are a couple other areas of the law, but where, we have separation of church and state. So the government can't endorse a particular religion under the Constitution, but where a religious leader, a pastor or a reverend, or there are different titles for spiritual leaders in different churches, act as an agent of the government. In this case, they are actually acting as an agent of the government, signing your civil marriage license. So that's where, after the vital statistics law came along, how efficient, in many cases, a pastor, your pastor, could sign a government document and act essentially as an agent of the government when they marry people, which was quite an interesting relationship. And in some countries, they actually have separate civil and religious ceremonies. So even if you are married in a religious ceremony, you have to have a civil ceremony separately to keep them separate. But here we allow a religious leader to act as an officiant. And sometimes the laws are really muddy, of who qualifies to be an officiant. You can be ordained online, and there have been court cases that say, if you're ordained online, the government can't determine what a church is and isn't, as long as they are, meet certain requirements. And if you become an quote unquote ordained minister through that church, you can marry people. So that is a really gray relationship sometimes. So it's interesting to look back, or how people will look back at a marriage. But the reason that came about is because marriage was a religious thing before it became a government registered thing. It was a private contract through your church, essentially. And then because of a concern about disease spreading and things like that, the government had a vested interest in making sure that deaths were recorded, births were recorded, and marriages were recorded. And then that also led into, there were concerns about spread of disease, so they required blood tests before you could get married. They were concerned about the spread of syphilis, particularly, and so you would have a blood test beforehand, and the government had claimed that they had a vested interest. The health department, yet again, the health department is in charge of the registering of all the vital statistics. that they had to keep track of these diseases. And so one of the ways they did that is before people married is to require the blood test. So, but that leads into our guy here, Reverend Richard Sandford, who is one of my favorite people from the history of our town here. I'm going to put his picture up, a couple pictures of him. I tried doing it in the comments. It doesn't usually, for whatever reason, I can't post easily while I'm talking. So I'll do it later for the folks who are watching later. And I promise you, when I put his picture up, it looks like he's not a very happy person, but that was just the photography at the time. One of the pictures is a portrait of him, and another one is of him in the Presbyterian Church, which stood at the corner of Main and Church Street, and that's how Church Street got its name. Then the Presbyterian Church moved over to what is Payne Street today. But he was called the Marrying Minister. And the reason he was called the Marrying Minister, and I wrote about him a while back, actually, I think for February, in honor of Valentine's Day a few years ago. And the reason he got called the Marrying Minister is because he officiated, united more than 650 couples in East Aurora. He was the Presbyterian minister, the pastor of the Griffin's Mills Church, the Griffin's Mills Presbyterian Church today, Congregational Church originally. And this was in the late 1800s. And for about 30 years, I believe, he pastored at Griffin's Mills, and then he came to East Aurora. And then for a short time, he was the pastor of both the East Aurora Church here in the village, and then also the one in Griffin's Mills. And according to one of his biographies, he would do a sermon in the morning, and then go back up and do the sermon in Griffin's Mills in the afternoon. And I'm not sure if Griffin's Mills was the morning or vice versa, but he really was dedicated to his job and served both churches. And of course, today you can go up and down Mill Road fairly easily, but back then it would have been much more of a challenge in time, especially in the winter time, to make that commute from Griffin's Mills to East Aurora. He did live in Griffin's Mills with his family, and then after a while, I think here 1874, he moved to East Aurora because the congregations had grown, and East Aurora's congregation, of course, was bigger, and he was able to become a full-time pastor down here in the village of East Aurora. But he married, the reason he's called the marrying minister is he married not just the people in his congregation, but anybody who wanted to be married. And he's called the marrying minister because he did all these marriages, and he kept a very detailed record of each of these marriages. He gets the nickname the marrying minister because of all these marriages, but more importantly, I think, is he did just as many funerals and baptisms, and he was just a minister for, and his obituary actually mentioned this, that he was a minister also for people who weren't Christian. And he felt that everyone deserved a proper burial or deserved to be able to get married. And I loved the wording they said. I think it was in his obituary. The troubled and anxious ones came to him for counsel and advice, the sorrowing ones for comfort and encouragement. The lovers sought him to unite them in marriage. The mourners sent for him to bury their dead. He was a welcome guest in every home, and even those who refused to serve the master loved and respected this man of God. So he really was a minister for the community and people who maybe didn't have a church. He not only married them, he conducted their funerals, baptized them. He was a general minister for the community, not just a Presbyterian minister, which I thought was very, very interesting. So he kept this log, not just of marriages, but of the deaths and the funerals and the births and the baptisms. All of his sermons are kept in a log, And we have that log preserved, and by we I mean the community owns this. The people of East Aurora now have it as part of the collection in the town archives and the town historian's office. The reason I think we have that is because um, uh, uh, Richard Sandford, well, that sounds awful familiar to Richard Sandford Persons, who was the first, well, the town historian in 1950. And he did a lot to gather a lot of documents from the community. So the family connection, I'm almost certain, is what led to it being preserved. This big collection of documents from Richard Sandford, Reverend Sandford, being preserved. So in addition to him doing all this, marrying people in town, and being at their funerals, he documented, as a good minister would, documented all the things that he did, and we have it preserved. So why is this important? Well, because like I said, vital statistics didn't come around until 1881. Here in the town of Aurora, our records are a little later too. One reason was because someone said there was a fire, but I think maybe some of it was that the law took a while for people to get used to. So we don't have records until about the 1890s. In the town clerk's office, the vital statistics records are held there. So he was a minister from the 1870s here in East Aurora through close to his death. He retired, but then he continued as the marrying minister, marrying people up until close to his death in 1897. So 1865 is when he was appointed to the church, and then just before he died in 1897. So over 30 years of records and of him marrying people. And the reason I know it's more than 650 is I literally went through the logs one day and counted how many people he married, as well as his obituary, I believe, mentioned that. So the reason this is important because, well, if he was appointed in 1865, like I said, 1881 is when the vital statistics records started. So his log, which starts a little later, includes information that we would not have in vital statistics records. So he kept a log of all the marriages, not only the marriages, but who the witnesses were, where the wedding occurred, and other information like their occupation, things that would be in the vital statistics record today. So we're indebted to him to know who got married and when they got married, and make these connections because of the records he kept. One of the couples that he did marry were my great-great-grandparents, and I found that out by going through someone later on, which we are very thankful for, made an index of all the marriages that he conducted. So I was able to find, I thought, well, I'll look through and see if there's any marriages that I'm related to, people that I'm related to, and Louis Knox and Cora E. Bourne, who are my great-great-grandparents, were married on June 25th, 1893, and they're included, they were married by Reverend Sandford. I don't believe they were Presbyterians, so they were an example of a couple that he would have married that maybe weren't members of his church, which is wonderful. That's how he got the name the marrying minister. I think it's important there's probably people like that in each community who kept records like that, personal, essentially he kept a journal. After the vital statistics records were required, he kept his own copy. The ministers would keep their own copy of the vital statistics record that they would send to the Board of Health, send to the town. Officiants are required still to do that to this day, or they should. And so we have the copy of his end of the vital statistics records. So even after he was in that period of time of transition between his own records and the vital statistics records. A fascinating guy. He also, in addition to being the marrying minister and being the pastor of two congregations at the same time for a while. He was very active in East Aurora's temperance movement, so against alcohol, and that was a huge political issue back then. They actually had votes on whether during his time period, so he would have lived during a very interesting time period, right after the Civil War, and into the 1890s and early 1900s. The towns would actually vote on the wet-dry question, they'd call it, whether you would allow saloons, whether the sale of alcohol. And he was on, and they would have a town meeting, and they would vote at these town meetings every year to determine whether you would allow alcohol sale in your town. This was before Prohibition, and it would be town by town, and every year this would come up. So one year you could have the town allowing the sale of alcohol, and in another year you would vote no. And it was a huge political issue, and it would be the headlines of the newspaper. And he was on the side of anti-alcohol, so he was very active in that movement, and he did a lot of other things for the community. But the one thing that he is known for is how many marriages he conducted and the records that he kept of it. And so on this Valentine's Day, I thought it'd be neat to talk a little bit about him. I will also post a link to the article I wrote a couple years ago about him. Very interesting details, a lot of details about him. That are quite interesting. If you want to, if you have a marriage that you think that from that time period that you think you might have, you're looking for somebody doing genealogy, just send an email to the historian's office, historian@townofaurora.com, and I'd be glad to take a look into the index. We keep the original. Now, when I say we have his records, they are the original records, like some of the original log that he kept, as well as the individual copies of the second copy that he kept, handwritten, of his records. Those are locked away, those for safekeeping, and we have indexes. So we will pull them out if we know where we're going. But we use the index first. We have all the names to be able to tell you if they exist in his records. And it's funny when someone will call about or email about a marriage record, I'll say, well, let me check Reverend Sandford first, because if he married the person, we have all the information we need, because he was so detailed with the marriage records. Again, I'll post the article about him. And if you have any questions about marriage, the history of marriage or marriage laws, or you're looking for a particular marriage record, let me know. Sometimes you have to file through the town clerk's office or the state health department, and there are regulations with that. But if we can find a record in the newspaper, another problem we do have is that East Aurora didn't have a newspaper, and a lot of communities have gaps in their newspapers. The East Aurora Advertiser didn't start till 1872, and there's some, the first years are a little sparse when it comes to the remaining papers that we still have. So until about the 1880s, we don't have a solid set of the early East Aurora Advertisers. And before that, the newspaper we had was the Aurora Standard in the 1830s. For 3 years in the 1830s, they did an incredible job of recording local marriages and births and deaths. But the problem is it was only 3 years in the 1830s. So any period in between that, there's a gap. And even after the Advertiser came along, they would sometimes put in there, it's not those big long marriage announcements, wedding announcements that people put in 1950s and 60s that told you, the gave a description of the dress and the mother of the bride's dress and the mother of the groom's dress. It would only be sometimes a little announcement, and wouldn't give details. So Reverend Sandford's records give you a little more detail about where the wedding took place and who was involved. So that's why that's really important as well. So there are a lot of places you can go to get marriage information about a marriage, and not just the marriage license itself, but if that exists. So again, thank you for joining us. I hope this was an interesting chat. I enjoy talking about interesting people from our past, and Reverend Sandford is certainly one of them. And if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the comments or send me a private message. And I'll see you next week on Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And of course, if you can't watch live,